We're joined now by Andrew Fowler, Australian journalist who has been maybe the journalist in Australia who's written most wisely and deeply about Wikileaks than any other. And we're welcome to have you on the program, Andrew.
My pleasure.
Someone at the press conference at the end with Kristinn said that the Australian media had turned around, basically, in Julian's favor. Is that true?
I think that certainly is true, Joe. Yes, there has been a move towards supporting Assange, and I think particularly that happened after the 18 charges against Julian Assange were made public, and the threat of 175 years in jail now hangs over every journalist who publishes material that the United States of America deems to be secret or classified. And that's a great way to motivate people, if you like. It's the overreach by the United States in this area may be a problem, maybe a boomerang, maybe actually will generate support for Assange that wasn't there before.
Did you see that coming?
Don't think that anybody saw the charges coming more recently, although Assange has repeatedly said that the real intent has been since 2010 to extradite him to the United States, and that's the reason he, as we know, went to the Ecuadorian embassy, and that's why he's tried to stay out of custody. That's why he was in the Ecuadorian embassy for so long, fearing that he'd be extradited. So to the extent that I don't think anybody saw after the Obama administration decided not to go ahead with the charges, people didn't see it coming in with Trump, but it was always hanging over Assange's head, and Assange is infuriatingly right. He very often calls it, and you don't believe it, you don't accept it, you challenge it, and yet again Assange is right here, and he's right about his own predicament.
Did you see the Australian media coming around in his favor?
I've seen it slowly moving towards his favor, yes. And I think there's a lot to do with the fear that they are next, more than anything else. For some reason, the Australian media has been very slow in backing Assange, and I really can't get to the bottom of that. Sociological problems, political attitudes, a very conservative country. But that's what's happened, and I now see people that were arguing with me and opposed to Assange and opposed to Wikileaks, particularly over the Clinton emails, which seems to ignite more opposition than any other single act. They've now realized that and speak out in favor of Wikileaks and in favor of Assange.
Now, of course, it was only a couple of weeks, I think, after Assange's arrest that there were the two raids in Australia, in Sydney and then down in Canberra, I think, and at the ABC.
Yeah.
What did that do to the press? I mean, there was a pretty big pushback. I was in Australia, actually, at the time. I was quite happy to see the response from people at ABC and others in the media against what had happened. Yes, I mean, that had to give them the message, that they could be next, because some of them were next.
Yes, I mean, it did. I think it did give them the feeling that they might be next. But what they had to then confront was the fact that they had spent so long not supporting the very person who'd experienced that many times over and had revealed information that the United States wanted kept secret. So how did they deal with these two issues? They actually had been raided themselves, and now they find that they have just maybe the previous month or previous year been attacking the very people who'd suffered the same problems, and this guy in particular facing so many years in prison. That seems to have been resolved, at least in some areas. People now seem to recognize that they were next, and now you can now see it historically. The ABC was next, and so that has actually made them sharpen up and realize that they need to support an aggressively open media campaigning in the way that WikiLeaks campaigns.
And there was even a link with Afghanistan between the two cases with WikiLeaks and the ABC story.
There is an interesting pattern of events that you rightly point to there, that Afghanistan appears to be the issue that's causing this. It seems that, and I've not looked at the detail, but it does seem to be that the Afghanistan story that the ABC did, the Afghan war logs, which is what the Americans are banging on about so much, those two things are joined together. And then you have also the issue of redacting the Afghan names or not, the expose by WikiLeaks of that war crime when people were killed by a special operations team in Afghanistan. You get that stuff coming to the fore again. and you get the whole issue of the Afghan peace talks going on with the Taliban. And it seems that there's something happening there which fits together to suppress or control information.
There was, speaking of the sociological reasons for why the media supports government against the people and against Julian, is clearly careerism has something to do with it, and mere survival, keeping your job. I mean, there's a lot of fear working inside the mainstream media. I did it for 25 years. I know what it's like to try to push your editors to do a story that somehow goes against the agenda that they're pushing, which is to protect the interests of the state and their own American interests abroad. In my case, when I worked at the Wall Street Journal, I mean, it was clear that they were covering stories to help American interests outside the country, not covering neutrally international conflicts, which are complex, and each side has their own interests, and nobody's right or wrong in many of these cases. But of course, the U.S. was always right in international affairs. So it's very hard to push up against a press that sucks up to power, because sucking up to power usually means good things for you in the short term. But when you talk about the role the media has in pressuring government, I was just mentioning to Kristinn how Dan Ellsberg told me that he originally wanted to go to the Congress first thinking he'd get press coverage, and then he realized it was the other way around. He'd have to go to the New York Times with the Pentagon Papers, and then maybe Congress would act.
Yes.
So, I mean, Scott Morrison's a very tough nut to crack on this Assange issue, amongst others. How could the media push even Scott Morrison to say, okay, I'm going to try to get Julian to come back home?
At the moment, there is a campaign, because of the oppressive nature of the surveillance and counter-terrorism laws in this country and the defamation laws. There's actually a campaign here on press freedom, which has been running very, very strongly. Newspapers are publishing every other day or every day stories with information blacked out, and it was part of a campaign. So there's that motivation that's going on. Murdoch, not a supporter of Assange, is spearheading this campaign for a more open media and for the governments to be held to account, transparency. Whether or not you like Murdoch, that's a positive for this campaign for transparency and openness. On top of that, you've got to have any old bedfellow you can grab, right? On top of that, you've got the Assange case as well. Now, these two things have existed separately until recently. They've now collided because of the overreach of the Department of Justice in trying to extradite Assange out of London, and they're now seen as one and the same thing. So what Morrison has to do is to deal with the issue of press freedom, including Assange. Assange has become, from somebody who was sidelined and kept out of the mainstream argument and vilified by the mainstream media, he's now become part of, not exactly the poster boy of this campaign, but somebody who cannot be denied to be part of the campaign. You can't talk about media freedom without talking about an Australian banged up in prison, facing 175 years jail in the United States. And it's united people across the political spectrum, from the left to the right, inside Parliament. It's a really interesting phenomenon and a very positive thing for Assange and for the campaign. So although I'm not really hopeful about it, I mean, I'm just not pessimistic.
You know, I mean, maybe they really made a mistake going after one of Murdoch's journalists, going through her underwear and whatnot when they raided her home. I mean, Murdoch press had to stand up against that, obviously.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, I mean, there are people who are appalling politicians who are now supporting Julian Assange, and there are great people who are great politicians supporting Assange. And so you've got this from the extreme, as I say, left to the libertarian right and to the crazy right coming together. And you've got Murdoch as well, all involved in this campaign for freedom and press freedom. So it's a really interesting moment. Now, how Morrison deals with that, he can ignore it up to a point, but he can't ignore the campaign for press freedom. So he'll try and buy it off. He'll try to do a deal where journalists will be protected from this and that, and be some sort of a fig leaf, if you like, to offer up to the campaign. So it's not over yet, but at least it's not as gloomy as it was 6 months ago.
Well, it's a little nauseating, but it seems that Morrison has a good relationship with Trump, personal relationship.
Oh, yeah.
And Trump claims he never even heard of WikiLeaks. He doesn't know who they are, right? His Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who of course was CIA director when Vault 7 came out.
Yeah.
has made some of the most vicious, determined statements to get Assange.
Yep.
It could be seen as the driving force behind his arrest and this indictment. He was left behind in the NATO summit going on in London. Trump went over and left his Secretary of State behind in Louisville, Kentucky. And I guess 2 weeks ago, there was a story that Pompeo's leaving and could be running for the Senate. So he might be on the way out. I wonder, a combination of Corbyn winning in London and Pompeo leaving the State Department could really alleviate some of the pressure on Scott Morrison to have to go along and give him a little courage, maybe. To do something that may win him support back home amongst his voters.
Sure. I think it's a good take. The Pompeo stuff, I think Vault 7 was a turning point. I think that was the thing more than anything else that drove them over the top to overreach with these charges. I think you're right. I think if Corbyn wins, then and those things fall into place, then it's possible for Morrison to move and to actually make that kind of request. But on the other side, actually, if Corbyn wins in London, then the charges will almost certainly be prevented from being prosecuted, because Corbyn is on the record as saying that he would resist the extradition. Now, I understand it's not as easy as just saying, ever since the Pinochet case, it's not easy for the Prime Minister just to say, you can't go ahead with this charge. But it certainly would be a lot easier if Corbyn wins, because he's sympathetic, and you could run it's a political crime, and therefore is in breach of the extradition treaty. And also, if they feared for his life, they could say he was too sick, because it certainly seems to be in a terrible, terrible state. I met Julian many times, but more recently when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, I went there 3 times to see him, and he was really in a good space, and he was fighting the fight and still running WikiLeaks. And now, from what I hear from Jen Robinson and from Kristinn Hraffnson, that he's really in really quite depressed and worn down by his experiences. So you could run the argument that he is actually not capable of really being put into an American prison in a country where the president says that the media are the enemy of the people. I mean, it's just it's an argument that they could run, and maybe they could get the extradition squashed.
Do you know if a new Home Secretary could revoke the extradition, or is that too late once it's done?
My understanding is that the extradition treaty was changed. Margaret Thatcher actually stopped the extradition of Pinochet, and then after that, I'm told the law was changed, which made it actually not possible for the Home Secretary, Prime Minister, maybe Home Secretary, to actually override it. But there are 2 provisions. One, I think, is a political charge, where if you're charged with a political offence, then the extradition can be stopped. If you're charged with an offence which may lead to your death or to severe physical punishment, then that could also weigh in the balance. But it's not a clear case of just being able to say, I'm the Home Secretary, I'm stopping this extradition because of the extradition treaty.
Of course, even if Scott Morrison made a representation to the British government, they don't have to listen to Scott Morrison, right? They don't seem to be listening to anyone on this. They're not listening to Nils Melzer for sure.
No, that's right. They don't have to do anything. I mean, America is it's a law unto itself. It's determining a completely unilateralist policy on just about everything. So, why should any international treaty be upheld? And I think that that would be a problem. I don't think Morrison would have to feel there's some political mileage to be gained or pain to be suffered for him to move on this issue. He would have to really feel that his back was to the wall. The problem with Morrison is that the threat comes from the right inside his party. Believe it or not, Morrison's actually quite a moderate compared to some of the crazies that there are on the right in this country. So he's got to appease them. And doing anything with Assange, apart from the libertarians, wouldn't be helpful for him politically. But at the same time, if this starts to resonate in opinion polls and in sampling, and it starts to become an issue, that's where they start to take notice. And but then you've got to get from there to actually get them to make the representation to the United States or to the UK, and then get those people to actually listen and take action. So it's a 2-step or 3-step approach. The only positive thing I can say is at the moment is that at least things are not as gloomy as they were, and that the tide of journalistic opinion and political opinion is turning in favour of Julian Assange.
How important was it to have Kristinn come over to Australia and speak with ABC and Planet America and at the press club today?
Really important. It was a fantastic speech. He wrote. He read a fantastic speech. He was clear. He was open. He was decent. He was all the things that you would never get the opinion reading the mainstream media or any kind of program on national television. That Kristinn Hraffnson was like that. It's the same message you get about Assange. You actually get Assange being painted as being some sort of crazy demagogue, authoritarian figure. He's actually nothing like that. He's quite charming. So actually, Kristinn actually talked about his relationship with Julian Assange and just made those points. And Hraffnson is of the same mold, a decent, honest, open person. And he did the campaign and the cause for media freedom and for Wikileaks and for Julian Assange absolute great service to come and speak to the press club. And it was very well received. And people I talked to and friends of mine who've been a bit ambivalent about WikiLeaks, particularly with the Clinton emails, they said that he won them over.
You said before that Julian wasn't actually the poster boy for this coalescing of events towards press freedom in Australia. However, the man, Somerset Bean, I think his name is, who was a poster, who makes the posters, just was informed today that by Google that the Department of Justice in Washington here has asked for all of his Google-related materials. So what does this mean? Does this mean that they are going after people who make posters of Julian Assange in Australia? I mean, I don't understand that.
No, I don't understand that either. I don't know what that, Google were being forced to hand it over, or what it was. I have no idea. I actually said that Julian, he's not exactly the poster boy. I mean, that's
right. Well,
he's kind of, he's on his way to being. He should be the poster boy, but he's
right. I was using that as a segue to ask you about the guy who made the posters.
You did a good job there, yeah. But
because there are a lot of people who believe that the DOJ is going after others, and they want to destroy WikiLeaks, not just get Julian, and that they're working in concentric circles. So therefore, how important is this new release of the OPCW email? It shows that WikiLeaks is still alive and kicking and doing its job. I think I'm very encouraged by that. Are you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea would be to grind WikiLeaks into the ground, to absolutely destroy it, and to destroy anybody who supports it as well, probably. That's exactly what it appears to be, a political witch hunt. And certainly the way they've gone after Julian Assange is completely out of what can you say? There's no historical precedent to take a publisher, a journalist, and to prosecute them for what journalists do. If Assange is prosecuted for what he did, the next step is everybody else. There is no free press in America. The First Amendment means nothing at all. I mean, we don't have the First Amendment in Australia. In fact, what we do have in Australia, just by the way, is all of the worst laws governing surveillance and counter-terrorism and defamation, with none of the protections. We don't have a First Amendment. We don't have the European human rights protection. We're completely exposed, and that's why this campaign in Australia is so important, and that's why with Assange being able to be played into this mix, it's a really crucial time for him, and this campaign's come along at the right time.
You've been around a long time, and you've seen there's always been tension between government and media from the very beginning. And sometimes the media gets the upper hand, sometimes the government does. But did you ever think you'd see the day where we would see a publisher being put in jail like this, in a high security prison, being mistreated and denied his rights, or even to prepare his defense? That we've come this far that they think they can get away with this in a supposedly democratic society and fool and distract the public into disliking and hating Julian Assange, when he's the one who, of course, exposed their own misdoings, and that's why they want him. So it's hard to fathom, if you're a believer in so-called Western democracy, that we've come to this point.
No, that's right. I mean, I did in fact believe that as a journalist things were getting better. And 10 years ago we were, one step forward, one step back, two steps forward, one step back, but we were making progress. I thought that that we were actually creating slowly a better world. That was what was happening. And of course, what's happened is now it's all come crashing down. It's as gloomy as ever I've seen it. It's as gloomy in Australia as I think it is in France and the UK, everywhere in Europe, and in the USA. I think it's a really gloomy time. And it reminds me of when I first met Daniel Ellsberg for the first book I wrote on Julian Assange. And I wrote a book and I interviewed Ellsberg, and he said to me, Julian told me that if you have a secret society and a secret state or secret organization, if you can break the secrecy, you can break it open, it will implode. It will destroy itself. You cannot run authoritarian regimes. They will destroy themselves. And what he said was, he didn't believe that. He said, he told Julian that what will happen is they will come for you and they will introduce harsher and harsher laws. They're more and more predatory. Your theory is wrong. In fact, it's going to get a lot darker than it is now. And I think, unfortunately, that Ellsberg is absolutely right.
I hate to say it, I agree with you. I think the turning point was the September 11 attacks in the U.S. That changed the surveillance picture in the U.S.
Yeah.
And it turned the media into sniveling cowards, really, to back their wars, especially the one in Iraq, where they did not allow any dissenting opinion to try to slow that war down. And they went on as absolute cheerleaders in that war to an extent I've never seen. And they were riding along with the military vehicles into the sands of southern Iraq. I mean, they were absolutely gung-ho on that war. And I don't think there's been any turning back. Of course, that happened before WikiLeaks existed. I asked Kristinn when he was on just now whether had WikiLeaks existed in 2003, whether he thought that maybe somebody could have leaked stuff to try to prevent the invasion of Iraq. The way somebody's now leaked stuff showed that the missile strikes in Syria that killed 8 people were based on fabricated evidence. Of course, the Iraq war was based on fabricated evidence and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. So he came around in the post 9/11 world already, WikiLeaks. So Julian did. And I think Ellsberg had it right. He understood the climate that we're living on. And I think that is what's changed the game that always existed between media and the government. It was a game. There were rules. Both sides kind of played within it. But that was broken, I think, by 9/11. And now there's no holds barred to go after Julian Assange and put him in jail for doing investigative journalism, which is what the indictment itself says. If you read it, it's actually describing journalism. Right. It says that Chelsea Manning had legal access to all those materials, so there was no hacking involved. He didn't help her to break into something. But the way he's portrayed is something so hard to overcome. It's so hard to overcome and gives cover to this brute force of the government, U.S. government, against an Australian who published outside Europe because of this amendment to the Espionage Act in 1961 that allowed this to be a global treaty, not just on U.S. territory. That's what we're fighting against here. And I wonder if the U.S. should be brought International Court of Justice somewhere to try to challenge the global nature of their war that runs roughshod over other nations' laws.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that's certainly a course of action. I mean, the Europeans stand up to a certain extent against some of the hegemonic moves of the United States over Iran, but it's a really, really difficult fight. The United States is still the single superpower in the world. It's extremely hard to fight against them. What you want or what you need is the American people to, through their democratic systems, to actually change it and to get it right, to actually get a president that's actually going to be a half decent human being, to actually, take the role that America always saw itself as the light on the hill. It's a place where you would go to find truth and justice and freedom. Those are the things that were emblematic to America. And Australians still, by the way, they still feel that. They feel that when the Americans entered the war and helped stop the Japanese advance, that resonates really strongly here. There's a great positive feeling the moral strength of America. I know you laugh about that, but
No,
that's
I'm not laughing.
but
Because that's 70 years ago.
yeah, but that's
Yeah.
but that still is here.
I
I'm
know.
telling you,
Not just there.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. And I wonder, I always marvel at that, how the U.S. still living on fumes of World War II.
Yeah.
They're still seen in this positive way around the world,
Yeah.
as they were by Ho Chi Minh, who modeled the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam from France, on the American Declaration of Independence, and asked Truman his 6 letters for help, and they were all ignored. People around the world look, the Hong Kong protests are looking to the U.S. as if they really care about democracy and anywhere in the world, let alone in Hong Kong. And even in the U.S. leaders have used America's role in the war continuously as a way to gather support from American people. Yeah. For example, every government and leader they want to overthrow becomes Hitler. Milosevic was Hitler, Noriega was Hitler, Saddam was Hitler, Hillary Clinton called Putin Hitler. So once you hear them call someone Hitler, you know they're being targeted for overthrow. Yeah. And America fought Hitler, so we were the good guys then. And I think it's very hard to talk to American people about we're no longer the good guys. That is over. Yeah. We are, in many ways, the aggressors on the world scene. We are the bad guys, and Iraq was the preeminent example of that. And even though every Republican candidate stand up on, in his debate into the last election when Trump was elected, saying that was the biggest blunder in foreign policy American history, Iraq, it doesn't matter. It's like as if it didn't even happen here. Yep. And you say if there's some decent person become America, I can tell you right now that there's only 1 or 2 decent people running for president right now. And neither one of them has a good chance.
You raised the issue earlier about people coming out, and during the before the Iraq War, there were millions and millions of people that opposed the Iraq War, took to the streets. And there's one guy in this country who's now an MP, his name's Andrew Wilkie. He was working for the Office of National Assessments, which is basically, it was an intelligence clearinghouse. And he saw a lot of the raw data that was coming in, that he's making assessments. And he was so appalled by the government's position of going to war with the Americans in Iraq that he walked out of the building and he went to a television station, and the only person to actually do it before the war started. And he said, Iraq does not have weapons of mass destruction that threaten the West. I know, I've seen the detail of it. So that guy, that spirit was alive and well, that spirit of holding truth to power by an intelligence officer who came out and wanted to tell the public. There's no difference between him and Ed Snowden walking out and doing the same thing, or Chelsea Manning. It's like you cannot crush the truth in people. They will always find a way to get it out if they feel that they've been morally, it's a moral decision. So they can prosecute Julian Assange, they can put him in jail. I mean, he could die in jail. It's not going to stop people from speaking out, from actually speaking the truth to power. I mean, it's quite appalling to think that that's what this is really all about. It's vindictive and it's punishment of a person who's doing his job as a journalist. And what has appalled me until now has been that journalists have been so slow to come to his support. Very few of them, now more and more, merely because I believe, somewhat skeptically, I believe that they fear that it's going to take their job away from them, that they could be next, that they could be hauled off to America if they get their hands on a secret document that the Americans don't want published.
Well, it's absolutely wide open, as you said. That tool was always there in the Espionage Act. It was never used before. This does change everything, but I do think that as long as major media plays ball with government, and with the powers behind the government and a deep state, and let's call it that, and the intelligence agencies. Yeah. And let's face it, the intelligence agencies seem to use the media to launder their disinformation. If they get up there and say something, people may be skeptical, but if it's reported in the New York Times, it's believed. But they just, anonymous sources leaking even classified information from inside the agencies through the New York Times is perfectly okay. And you can damn well be sure they're not going to prosecute the New York Times for doing that. However, exactly. The Times might be more reluctant to have done what they did with Wikileaks, which was to publish the Cablegate and the collateral murder, etc. That might not happen so easily. Right.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, Judith Miller was, just being subjected to just official leak after official leak after official leak. Just a political manipulation. The intelligence was not showing what she was saying it said, and And consequently, we ended up with the New York Times, looking like a complete goofball organization. It was far too close to the Democrats, far too close to the establishment. And I think it may have sort of walked back a bit from that. I subscribed to the New York Times as one of the sort of beacons of at least a half decent media that does ask questions and does reveal information that is in the public's right to know. But I do think that they clearly got it wrong with that. They got it wrong with the NSA stuff that they failed to publish until it was going to come out in a book. So they do learn the lessons, and I think their readership base may have been improved by them actually standing up and running the WikiLeaks material. So
I wonder about that, because after the invasion of Iraq, they actually published an unprecedented front page editorial apologizing to their readers for having misled them about the intelligence. Of course, they had to fire Judy Miller, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But they were back at it again with Russiagate and spreading all kinds of things without any evidence. And we wound up knowing now that there was no collusion between Trump and the Russians. That's what Mueller concluded. But that's not what the New York Times, CNN, particularly MSNBC here in the U.S., were saying every single night. We have in this.
And here in the ABC, we had the ABC ran a three-parter, which just ran the same thing about the collusion, and it was clearly not true. But so the ABC here has been moving towards this completely. I mean,
I don't think there were lessons learned. I don't think
Their appalling program on Assange, and an appalling interview with Hillary Clinton, where she was allowed to make all sorts of assertions about Assange being Putin's bitch, which was tweeted afterwards. I mean, these sort of things are just are for me, and I used to work for the program. They're really quite gloomy, and I've spoken publicly about this and written about it, and many people inside the ABC said I was right in what I said. It gives me no pleasure in doing this. I think that this system, this situation where the media becomes the channel of the powerful and the interested parties is unsustainable. Eventually, we just become a one-party state. We become a state without any opposition. So it eventually, maybe not in my lifetime, but this thing turns around, and you have maybe not a revolution, an uprising, but something overthrows the old order, and it's got to go one way or the other.
Yeah, well, Kristinn spoke to me about Emile Zola and the Dreyfus case, and he takes some optimism from that maybe 10 years later.
Yeah.
I think there's an occupational hazard in journalism. It's called vanity, and getting yourself on TV. It's very seductive to want, and you were on TV. I've never been a TV journalist, so I can imagine how even more seductive it is that you're going to become well known, and you've made it. You're somebody, and then that takes precedent over your job as a reporter, which
Absolutely.
is the responsibility to the public, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is. I mean, print journalists. That's where I come from. I come from print journalism, and I've worked with television for a long time. And when people, particularly TV journalists, accuse Julian of being a narcissist, I say, but you work in television. We're surrounded by narcissists. It's narcissism central. I mean, how can you possibly criticize Assange for being a narcissist? I mean, he's not a narcissist. He's actually a good journalist, and quite frankly, he's much better than many of the journalists that I've worked with who accuse him of being a narcissist.
Would he be one would he risk his skin in prison time, as he now is in, if he were a narcissist, if he was doing it for himself, rather than taking those incredible risks? Extraordinary.
It's ridiculous, and it's not relevant to it anyway. I mean, it's like this. Look, we can talk all day, but the argument about about the documents, and somebody asked a question at the press club here. They said, this document, should you have asked Kristinn, should you have known about, the Hillary Clinton document, where it came from, what was the motivation of the person that leaked it? And Kristinn took the question really well and explained that it's not our job to really work out the motivation of the leaker. That is irrelevant, I think, unless it actually plays centrally to the verification of the document. If you can verify the document, who cares where the information came from? And it just seemed to me that there's this whole fixation on, there's a whole Hillary Clinton fan club, very often buoyed up by the Me Too movement, pinned to it as well. And they just see this as being an attack on Hillary Clinton and on feminism and on the first president of the United States being a woman. And it was WikiLeaks that burst her balloon, and it's all Assange's fault. And that's the argument that runs. And of course, as Kristinn pointed out, well, if you had that document, what would you do with it? If you had a document that showed that Hillary Clinton was being given inside information about Bernie Sanders, about her major opponent, what would you do before an election? You'd publish, because the public has a right to know that. Now, that question was asked in a national press club by a journalist. I got to seriously ask you the question, what the hell is that person doing in journalism if they need to have corroboration that the person is a white knight who actually, was pure in making the leak? Leakers aren't pure. They got a grudge. They got an axe to grind. I was asked that myself, and I had documents before. I say, what have they got? Have they got an axe to grind? I said, yeah, they got a huge axe to grind. I don't care. It's great. The bigger the axe, the bigger the leak, the better it is.
Well, it's amazing that a journalist, the public doesn't understand the difference between, I think, an oral statement made to a journalist and a document. When you get a document and it checks out, it doesn't matter if it was the devil who gave it to you. If it's true, it's true. Bob Perry, the founder of Consortium News, told a story that when he was doing the Iran-Contra investigation, he went to his front door to pick up the newspaper one morning, and there he found a package, and inside were all these incredible documents. He has no idea, he had no idea until the day he died, who gave him those documents. But they were valuable. He checked them out. They were correct. They were certified. They were authenticated. But when somebody's telling you something orally without any document to back it up, then you have to check out their motives. Why are they telling you this? You have to get other sources to corroborate it. It's much more difficult.
That's the point. Get the other sources. Give me corroboration. Give me verification. Give me somebody who will actually appear before a court to say, I know this to be true.
But when it's a document, you don't need that when it's a document.
You don't need it. No, if you don't need it.
Official government document, that's what you're looking for. That would be the corroboration of a statement. Now you got the corroboration without needing the original statement that you wanted to corroborate.
That's right.
Well, you talked about Hillary and the feminist issue, and I wondered, it just occurred to me that obviously probably occurred to a lot of other people before it just did to me, that the Swedish, trumped-up Swedish case played perfectly into that, to smear him as a rapist as well. Against being against women, for example, and against Hillary, and he's told that story before, Kristinn, how they didn't get any verifiable documents on Trump. They actually did. Stefania Maurizi, the Italian journalist who worked with WikiLeaks on those Podesta releases, said that they actually had some Trump stuff, and they found out later that it had already been published. And if you look at the film Risk by Laura Poitras, there's a scene where Julian's on the phone. And this is way before April 2018, where he says, we just got some interesting material on Hillary Clinton, and I'm hoping to get something on Trump. He said that way before.
Yeah.
So that shows you he wanted stuff on Trump too.
Yeah.
He was certainly no Trump fan. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that he was. But he didn't get anything on him. And one other point I would make is that Trump was an open book. He was going out there talking about grabbing pussies. He was going out there talking about all the Mexicans are rapists and murderers. He was filthy. He was baiting racists. He was misogynistic. He was as horrible as you can be. So, I mean, you didn't even need to find something out about him. He was exposing himself, and he won anyway, which is a sad commentary. But, I mean, they would have published something if they had something on Trump. I don't think that questioner and others who asked that question believed Kristinn. That's just my feeling. I think they think he's lying.
Really?
It's troubling.
Yeah.
They think they've been told he had stuff on Trump and didn't use it.
Right, yeah.
And people believe that. They've been told over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's not true.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I believe, as you do, that if Julian had a good story, he'd run it. He had a good leak, he'd run it. He's just got journalism running through his veins. He just would publish and be damned.
Yeah, and going back to what we were saying before about it being a document, doesn't matter who the source is. I think this whole debate about whether it was a leak or a hack, the DNC, is irrelevant.
Yeah, sure.
Doesn't.
Oh,
and it's irrelevant because they have drop boxes now. Wall Street Journal has a drop box, and now I think ABC just started one. I think Kristinn mentioned.
Indeed.
So therefore, maybe Russia's putting stuff anonymously into ABC's Dropbox, and they're publishing it.
Who cares, provided it's accurate?
Yeah, well, see that would exactly. So it doesn't matter who stole the emails. It's a matter whether they were true or not. They were. And people at the DNC had to resign because of it.
Absolutely.
That's all that matters. That's all that should matter anyway.
That's right.
Andrew, thank you so much. I don't want to keep it any longer. Are you ever planning to do another follow-up book on
Yes.
WikiLeaks? Because that was like that is like the book on WikiLeaks, the first one.
Yeah, I'm doing it. Yeah, I'm doing one now. I just, in fact, if I wasn't talking to you, I'd be doing my research for the update. It's coming out. Yeah. Okay.
blame the public. Tell your publisher it was my fault that you're missing the deadline. I appreciate you hanging out and talking to us here.
No, it's a pleasure, Joe.
Okay.
Okay.
So that was Andrew Fowler, Australian journalist, joining us from Canberra after the Kristinn Hraffnson press conference.